What happens when unchecked arrogance collides with silent power at 35,000 feet on a routine flight from New York to London? One woman's prejudice ignites a firestorm. She demanded a young black girl be moved from her first-class seat, citing a discomfort she couldn't or wouldn't explain. What she didn't know was that her entitled demand wasn't just an insult. It was a career-ending, life-altering mistake. Because while she was a passenger in seat 2B, the quiet girl in seat 1A belonged to the family that had just hours earlier finalized their acquisition of the entire airline. This isn't just a story about karma. It's about the moment an empire of ignorance crumbled before a dynasty of grace. The first-class cabin of AscendAir Flight 762 was an oasis of curated calm. The scent of warm towels, lemongrass, and expensive leather mingled in the filtered air. It was a space designed to insulate its occupants from the mundane chaos of travel, a hermetically sealed bubble of privilege soaring 8 miles above the Atlantic. For 17-year-old Imani Washington, however, the quiet was a canvas for her thoughts. Tucked into seat 1A, a window seat pod that was more of a personal suite than a chair, she gazed out at the deepening twilight, her reflection a faint superimposition over the endless expanse of bruised purple sky. Her copy of Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower lay open on the polished, burled wood console, but her mind was elsewhere. It was on London on the prestigious summer program at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art she was about to attend. It was on her father, Marcus Washington, whose face, usually a mask of calm focus, had been alight with a nervous, triumphant energy all week. He and her mother, Dr. Lena Washington, were in the adjacent suite 1B, murmuring about finalizing the wire transfers and transition logistics. Imani knew it was a big deal. Her father's deals were always big, but the specifics were as usual kept in the rarefied air of adult conversation. She was a girl on the cusp of everything, a product of immense wealth, but raised with a profound sense of humility by parents who had started with nothing. Marcus was a tech mogul, a visionary who had built a software empire from a dorm room. Lena was a tenured professor of African American studies at Columbia University. They had ensured Imani understood the world not just from their penthouse on Central Park West, but from the ground up. She had volunteered in soup kitchens, worked on grassroots political campaigns, and read voraciously. She wore her hair in a crown of intricate braids, a style that was both a statement of pride and a work of art. Today she was dressed in a simple, comfortable but well-tailored navy blue tracksuit, a stark contrast to the designer labels dotting the cabin. The quiet hum of the Rolls-Royce engines was a soothing mantra, and the gentle clinking of crystal from the galley was the only percussion. Then a new sound disrupted the harmony, a sharp staccato click of heels on the cabin floor, followed by a sigh so theatrical it seemed to demand an audience. Annabelle Sterling arrived at seat 2B like a minor weather event. She was a woman in her late 40s, immaculately preserved and curated. Her blonde hair was a helmet of perfection. Her cream-colored pantsuit was ruthlessly tailored, and the Cartier bracelets on her wrist clanked softly as she wrestled a Gucci carry-on into the overhead bin. She huffed, casting a disdainful glance at the flight attendant who had rushed over to assist. "Thank you, I can manage my own things," she snapped her voice, carrying a clipped transatlantic accent that suggested old money and a new impatience. Settling into her seat, she began her ritual of sanctifying her space. She pulled out a silk pillowcase, a small bottle of lavender mist, and a cashmere wrap. Then her eyes, the color of a winter sky, scanned the cabin. They passed over the couple in 1B, lingered for a moment, on a hedge fund manager in 3D engrossed in his laptop, and then settled with jarring intensity on Imani in 1A. It wasn't a glance. It was an assessment, a categorization. Imani felt the weight of it, a familiar prickle on her skin she'd been taught to recognize, but had hoped to escape at this altitude. She saw the way Annabelle's lips tightened the subtle, almost imperceptible curl of her upper lip. It was a look that questioned her very presence in this exclusive space. Imani, feeling the heat of the stare, met the woman's gaze for a brief second before returning her attention to the window, her jaw set. She would not be made to feel small. She would not let this woman's silent judgment curdle the excitement of her journey. But Annabelle Sterling was not a woman who operated in silence for long. She flagged down the lead flight attendant, a kind-faced woman named Sarah with over 20 years of experience. "Excuse me," Annabelle said, her voice a low but piercing whisper. "I'm going to have a problem here." Sarah leaned in her expression one of professional concern. "Is everything all right, Miss Sterling?" Annabelle gestured vaguely, a flick of her wrist in Imani's direction. "I'm just not comfortable with the arrangement." Sarah's eyes flickered towards Imani, who was now pointedly ignoring them, her focus locked on the dark ocean below. "The arrangement, ma'am. Could you be more specific?" Annabelle said, the word dripping with a distaste she made no effort to conceal. "I paid a significant amount for this seat, for the ambiance, the serenity, and I just don't think I'm going to get it. I feel unsafe." The word hung in the air, ugly and charged. Unsafe. It was a weaponized word, a coward's term to dress up a raw, unvarnished prejudice. Sarah's professional smile faltered for a microsecond. She had dealt with every kind of difficult passenger, from the belligerently drunk to the neurotically demanding. But this was different. This was insidious. "Ma'am, I can assure you that all passengers in our first-class cabin have been through the same security checks," Sarah said, her voice carefully neutral. "This is a very quiet flight." "I'm sure you're not hearing me," Annabelle interrupted, her voice hardening. "This isn't about security checks. It's about decorum. It's about a standard one expects from a premier airline like AscendAir. I am a Platinum Elite member, for heaven's sake. I have certain expectations." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. "Look at her. The clothes, the hair. It just doesn't belong here. It feels like she was upgraded by mistake. It's a disruption." The accusation was as ludicrous as it was offensive. Imani's tracksuit was from a high-end athletic wear brand that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and her braids were a testament to hours of skilled work. But Annabelle didn't see that. She saw a stereotype, a caricature her mind had conjured to fit her world view. Sarah felt a surge of protective anger, both for the young woman being targeted and for the integrity of her profession. "Miss," she said, her tone a little firmer now, "that young lady is a ticketed first-class passenger just like you. She is not causing a disruption. In fact, she has been perfectly silent and respectful." From her seat, Imani Washington's head turned slightly. She had caught the tone, if not the exact words. Her husband Marcus lowered the financial report he was reading, his gaze sharpening. They didn't intervene, not yet. They had taught Imani to handle her own battles when she could, to meet ignorance with intelligence. But they were watching. Every nerve in their bodies was coiled and ready. Annabelle scoffed, a sound of pure disbelief. "So you're not going to do anything? You're just going to allow this situation to continue?" "There is no situation, Ms. Sterling," Sarah replied, her patience wearing dangerously thin. "Unless you are creating one." The gauntlet had been thrown. Annabelle's face, a mask of Botoxed placidity, flushed a blotchy red. Her eyes narrowed into slits. I see. So loyalty to your frequent flyers means nothing. Customer comfort means nothing. I want to speak to the captain. Now. And I want her moved. Find her a seat in the back of the plane. I'm sure she'll be more comfortable there anyway. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of the demand left Sarah momentarily speechless. She looked from Annabelle's twisted, hateful face to the back of Imani's head. The girl hadn't moved a muscle, but Sarah could imagine the tension in her shoulders, the hurt she must be feeling. This wasn't just a customer service issue anymore. It was a matter of basic human decency. And on Flight 762, decency was about to be put to the ultimate test. The storm had not just gathered, it was about to break. The demand to move her to the back echoed in the climate-controlled air of the cabin, a relic of a bygone era, so grotesquely out of place it felt like a tear in the fabric of reality. Sarah, the flight attendant, stood frozen for a beat, her mind racing through protocols and procedures, none of which covered this brand of naked bigotry. Sterling. She began, her voice low and strained. I am not going to ask another passenger to move their assigned, paid-for seat, especially not under these circumstances. Annabelle's eyes widened in theatrical disbelief. Under these circumstances, you mean the circumstance where a platinum elite member who spends over $100,000 a year with this airline is being made to feel uncomfortable by someone who clearly doesn't fit the profile of this cabin. She gestured around her. This is first class. First. It's supposed to be exclusive. It's the entire point. The confrontation was no longer a whispered exchange. Annabelle's voice had risen sharp and accusatory, slicing through the cabin's quietude. The hedge fund manager in 3D finally looked up from his laptop. His brow furrowed in annoyance. An elderly couple across the aisle exchanged a worried glance. The bubble of tranquility had popped. In Suite 1B, Marcus Washington placed a calming hand on his wife's arm. Lena's knuckles were white where she gripped the armrest. Not yet, he murmured, his voice a low rumble. Let's see how they handle this. This is a test for them, not for Imani. He was no longer just a concerned father. He was an owner conducting an impromptu, high-stakes audit of his new company's culture. Imani finally turned from the window. She didn't look angry or hurt. Her expression was one of weary contemplation, an old soul's gaze in a young woman's face. She looked directly at Annabelle, her eyes clear and steady. The lack of fear or intimidation seemed to infuriate Annabelle even more. What are you looking at? Annabelle spat, her veneer of sophistication cracking, to reveal something ugly and raw beneath. Imani's voice when she spoke was calm and clear, carrying the modulated precision of a debate champion. I was just wondering what you think gives you the right to demand my removal. The direct question caught Annabelle off guard. She had expected tears or perhaps a sullen retreat, not this quiet, unshakable confidence. The right, she stammered, flustered. I have the right of a paying customer who expects a certain standard, a standard that is clearly not being met. And what standard is that exactly? Imani pressed her voice even. Is it a standard of dress? Because my tracksuit is from the latest Fear of God Essentials collection. It probably cost more than your blazer. Is it a standard of behavior? Because I was sitting here silently reading a book until you began this disturbance. Each sentence was a carefully aimed dart, puncturing Annabelle's blustering sense of superiority. The hedge fund manager let out a low, appreciative oof. Annabelle's face contorted with rage. How dare you, you insolent little ma'am! Sarah stepped between them, her body forming a physical barrier. "That is enough. You are causing a disturbance. I'm going to have to ask you to calm down, or I will be forced to report this to the captain as a passenger interference event." Another flight attendant, a younger man named Ben, arrived from the galley drawn by the commotion. He was less experienced than Sarah and visibly nervous. "Is there a problem?" he asked, looking from his senior colleague's tense posture to Annabelle's enraged face. "Yes, there is a problem," Annabelle shrieked, seeing a new, perhaps more malleable audience. "Your colleague is refusing to do her job. She is siding with her," she pointed a trembling finger at Imani, "over a loyal, high-value customer. This is outrageous. I want the captain down here now. I'll have all of your jobs for this." The threat, a classic tool of the entitled, was designed to intimidate. On Ben, it worked. He paled his eyes, darting nervously towards the cockpit door. "Ms. Sterling, please let's just lower our voices," he pleaded. "Perhaps we can find a solution." "The solution," Annabelle declared, sensing a weakness she could exploit, "is for that girl to be moved. It's a simple request." Sarah shot Ben a look that could freeze jet fuel. "Ben, there is nothing to solve here. Ms. Sterling's request is based on prejudice, and we do not cater to prejudice on this airline." She turned back to Annabelle, her authority fully restored. "This is your final warning, Ms. Sterling. Return to your seat and cease harassing this young woman, or you will be in violation of federal aviation regulations." The mention of regulations seemed to finally penetrate Annabelle's fury. She knew on some level that she was treading on dangerous ground, but her ego so profoundly wounded by Imani's poise and Sarah's defiance refused to back down. She gave a derisive snort, collapsing back into her seat. "Fine," she muttered, pulling her cashmere wrap tightly around her shoulders as if to ward off a contaminant. "But this is not over. I will be filing the most damning complaint this airline has ever seen. I will be contacting my lawyer. The name Annabelle Sterling will be seared into your CEO's memory. You people have no idea who I am." She pulled out her phone, her thumbs flying across the screen as she began composing a furious email likely to AscendAir's generic customer service address. She was creating a paper trail of her own indignation, documenting what she perceived as a grave injustice. Imani watched her for a moment longer, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. It wasn't pity, not exactly. It was a kind of clinical observation, the way a scientist might observe a specimen fascinating in its own predictable, toxic way. She then turned to Sarah. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but sincere. "I appreciate you." Sarah gave her a small, reassuring nod. "It's my job to ensure all my passengers feel safe and respected, miss." Her eyes met Imani's, and in that brief exchange, an understanding passed between them, a shared acknowledgement of the ugliness they had just faced and defeated. As Sarah and Ben retreated to the galley, their whispered conversation was a mixture of residual adrenaline and disbelief. "Can you believe her?" Sarah breathed, leaning against a counter. "Find her a seat in the back. I haven't heard something so blatant in 20 years. She said she'd have our jobs." Ben fretted, polishing an already gleaming glass. "She's platinum elite. Those complaints get flagged, Sarah. They go right to corporate." "Let her complain," Sarah said, her voice steely. "If I get fired for refusing to enforce segregation on my flight, then so be it. This isn't the company I want to work for anyway." The sentiment was noble, but a seed of doubt had been planted. Corporate structures were fickle. Customer value metrics were often prejudice. Above. Principle. Annabelle Sterling, for all her odiousness, represented revenue. A formal complaint laced with accusations of poor service and unprofessionalism could have real consequences. The first-class cabin settled back into a tense, fragile silence. The air was thick with unspoken thoughts. Annabelle stewed in her self-righteous anger. Imani retreated back into the world of her book, and her parents in 1B continued their quiet observation. The immediate crisis had been averted, but the escalation had changed the atmosphere irrevocably. It was no longer a peaceful journey. It was a countdown. Annabelle Sterling had made a promise that her name would be known to the highest levels of AscendAir. She had no idea how quickly or how devastatingly that promise was about to be kept. For the next hour, a fragile truce held over the first-class cabin. Annabelle Sterling remained in her seat, radiating an aura of silent, simmering fury. She had refused a drink, rejected a menu, and communicated only through glares. She was marinating in her grievance, composing a mental lawsuit that grew more spectacular with every passing minute. Imani, to her credit, appeared completely unfazed. She had donned a pair of noise-cancelling headphones and was lost in her book, occasionally smiling at a passage. To any observer, she was the picture of tranquility. But beneath the surface, a different current was flowing. She was disappointed not for herself, but in the grim predictability of it all. It was a reminder that no amount of money, no seat in first class could fully insulate her from the corrosive acid of racism. In seat 1B, Marcus Washington had put away his financial reports. He'd made a decision. This incident could not be allowed to simply dissipate into an anecdote. It was a symptom of a deeper disease, a cultural rot that he, as the new owner, was now responsible for curing. He picked up the cabin satellite phone, a sleek device reserved for urgent communications. He turned to Lena. "I'm calling Captain Evans," he said quietly. "I'm not going to have Sra and her crew face repercussions for doing the right thing. And I'm not going to let that woman spend the next 6 hours poisoning the air in this cabin." Lena nodded, her expression firm. "Good. This needs to be handled. From the top." Marcus dialed the cockpit. Up front, Captain Michael Evans, a veteran pilot with a calm demeanor, was monitoring the flight's progress over Greenland. The call from the cabin was unexpected. Usually it was the lead flight attendant who called, and only for significant issues. "Evans here," he answered. "Captain Evans, this is Marcus Washington in seat 1B. I apologize for the direct call, but we have a situation back here that I believe requires your attention." The name registered with the captain. While the official internal announcement to all employees about the acquisition of AscendAir by Washington Industries wasn't scheduled until the following Monday, the top-tier executives and flight crews on premier routes had been briefed just hours ago. Marcus Washington was no longer just a passenger. He was, for all intents and purposes, the man who now owned the plane and everything in it. Captain Evans sat up straighter. "Mr. Washington, of course, I was made aware of your presence on this flight. I'm sorry for any disturbance. Sarah mentioned a difficult passenger. Is the situation ongoing?" "The passenger, a Ms. Annabelle Sterling in 2B, has ceased her verbal harassment for the moment," Marcus explained, his voice devoid of emotion. "However, before she did, she made a series of racist demands targeted a minor under my and my wife's care and threatened the jobs of your flight crew for refusing to comply with her prejudiced requests. Specifically, she demanded that my daughter be moved to the economy cabin because she felt her presence lowered the standard of first class." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. Captain Evans had heard it all, but the calculated malice of that request was chilling. "I understand, sir," he said, his voice now grim. "That is completely unacceptable. What would you like me to do?" We can have authorities meet her upon landing in London." "That will be happening," Marcus confirmed. "But I'm more concerned about the interim. I don't want your crew, particularly Sarah, to feel intimidated, and I don't want my daughter to be subjected to this woman's hostility for the remainder of the flight. I need you to come out here, Captain. I need you to address Ms. Sterling directly. I want her to understand in no uncertain terms the gravity of her actions." "Understood, Mr. Washington. I'll be there in 2 minutes." Evans turned to his first officer. "You have the con. I have to go deal with a fire in the cabin." When the cockpit door opened and the uniformed, broad-shouldered figure of Captain Evans emerged, the cabin's atmosphere shifted instantly. A captain leaving the cockpit mid-flight was a rare and serious event. Everyone, including Imani, who had removed her headphones, was now paying attention. Annabelle Sterling, however, saw it as a victory. A triumphant smirk flickered across her lips. Finally, she thought, someone with authority. She sat up, ready to plead her case, confident that the captain would understand the perspective of a fellow professional and high-value client. Captain Evans bypassed her seat completely. He walked directly to Suite 1A, 1B, and stopped addressing Imani first. "Miss Washington," he said, his voice warm and respectful. "On behalf of AscendAir and this entire crew, I want to offer you our most sincere apology for the distress you've experienced on this flight. This is not who we are, and this will not be tolerated." Imani gave a small, graceful nod. "Thank you, Captain." He then turned to Marcus and Lena. "Mr. and Dr. Washington, I've been assured the situation is contained for now." "Thank you for coming out, Captain," Marcus said, shaking his hand. "We appreciate your personal attention to this." Annabelle watched this exchange with growing confusion. Why were they apologizing to her? Why were they addressing this family with such deference? Her triumphant feeling began to curdle into a knot of anxiety. Then Captain Evans turned and walked to her seat. He stood over her, his shadow falling across her, his expression as hard and cold as the glacial ice fields they were flying over. "Ms. Annabelle Sterling," he began, his voice low, but carrying an unmistakable thunder of command. "I am Captain Evans. I have been made aware of your conduct on this flight. Your harassment of another passenger and your attempts to intimidate my crew are serious violations." Annabelle bristled, her confidence returning in a defensive surge. "Harassment? I was expressing my discomfort. Your flight attendant, Sarah, was incredibly rude and unprofessional. I am a Platinum Elite member, and I expect... I'm going to stop you right there. Ms. Sterling." The captain cut in, his voice dropping even lower. "Your status as a frequent flyer gives you privileges, not a license to be racist. It does not entitle you to demand a child be removed from her seat because of the color of her skin." The word racist, spoken with such authority, hung in the air like a conviction. Annabelle flinched as if struck. "I am not a racist," she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "I am a partner at Sterling and Finch Consulting. I sit on 3 diversity and inclusion boards. This is slander." Captain Evans remained unmoved. "Your resume is irrelevant. Your actions are what matter, and your actions have been appalling." He leaned in closer, his voice a near whisper that was somehow more terrifying than a shout. "You made a threat. You said you would make sure my crew's names were seared into the CEO's memory. Well, I think it's only fair to give you a chance to make your case directly." He gestured towards Marcus Washington, who was now standing. "Ms. Sterling, I'd like you to meet Mr. Marcus Washington. He and his family are the passengers you've been harassing for the last hour. He is also the founder and CEO of Washington Industries, the conglomerate that as of 5:00 p.m. Eastern Standard Time yesterday finalized its acquisition of AscendAir. He isn't just a passenger. He's the new owner of this airline. The revelation detonated in the silent cabin. Time seemed to stop. Annabelle Sterling's face went through a rapid, devastating series of transformations. First confusion, as her brain struggled to process the information. Then a flicker of dawning comprehension, followed by a wave of sickening, gut-wrenching horror as the full catastrophic reality of her situation crashed down upon her. The blood drained from her face, leaving her with a ghostly, pallid complexion that stood in stark contrast to her blotchy red neck. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The name she wanted, seared into the CEO's memory, was her own. And she had just spent the last hour personally branding it there with her own bigotry. She hadn't just made a scene. She had committed career suicide at 35,000 feet in front of the one man on Earth who held her fate and the fate of her precious, frequent flyer status in the palm of his hand. She finally understood. She wasn't the victim. She was the architect of her own spectacular downfall. The silence that followed Captain Evans's declaration was profound, a vacuum that sucked all the air and arrogance out of Annabelle Sterling. For a long-stretched moment, the only sound was the distant hum of the engines, a neutral witness to a life imploding. Annabelle's mind, usually a sharp analytical tool that had propelled her to the top of the corporate ladder, was a frantic mess of denial and panic. No, it's a trick, a bluff. They're trying to scare me. But a single look at Marcus Washington's face disabused her of that desperate hope. There was no triumph in his expression, no gloating. There was only a grave, piercing quietude, the calm of a man who held all the cards and felt no need to celebrate the fact. His power was so immense, it required no performance. It simply was. Annabelle's gaze darted around the cabin, as if seeking an escape route. She looked at Sarah, the flight attendant, whose face was a study in controlled neutrality, though a glint of vindication shone in her eyes. She looked at Ben, who seemed to be trying to shrink into the galley doorway. She looked at the hedge fund manager, who was now unabashedly watching the drama, a small, cruel smile on his lips. There was no help for her here. She was on an island of her own making. I don't believe you. She finally whispered the words, sounding flimsy and pathetic even to her own ears. Marcus Washington took a step forward. He wasn't menacing, but his presence was immense, filling the space. "It is not a matter of belief, Ms. Sterling," he said, his voice calm and resonant. "It is a matter of public record, or it will be on Monday morning when the markets open. You, however, are getting a preview." He gestured for Captain Evans to step aside. He then looked directly at Annabelle, his gaze analytical, almost detached. "You said you sit on diversity and inclusion boards," he stated, recalling her earlier defense. "I find that fascinating. Tell me, in your capacity as a D&I consultant, what would be your professional recommendation for handling an employee, or, in this case, a customer, who engages in the kind of behavior you've exhibited today?" The question was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. He wasn't just condemning her. He was forcing her to condemn herself, to use the very language of corporate accountability that she wielded as a weapon against others. Annabelle's throat worked, but no sound emerged. Her entire world, built on a foundation of status, reputation, and the power to intimidate, was crumbling in real time. The woman who advised Fortune 500 companies on crisis management was now in the center of a crisis so personal and so public, it was unsurvivable. I think there has been a misunderstanding," she stammered, her voice cracking. "No, I don't think there has," Lena Washington said, speaking for the first time. She had risen from her seat and stood beside her husband, her presence doubling their quiet authority. Dr. Lena Washington was not a CEO, but she was a formidable intellectual, a woman who had spent her life deconstructing the very systems of prejudice Annabelle embodied. "I think you were perfectly clear, Ms. Sterling." Lena continued, her voice cool and precise. "You saw a young black woman in a space you felt belonged to, and you decided she didn't belong. You didn't see a person. You saw a category, a disruption. You used coded, weaponized language like uncomfortable and unsafe to mask a vulgar, old-fashioned racism. There is no misunderstanding here. There is only clarity." Each word was a nail in the coffin of Annabelle's self-perception. She began to hyperventilate, her carefully constructed composure shattering into a million pieces. The mask of the powerful consultant fell away, revealing a panicked, frightened woman, stripped of her armor. "Please," she choked out the single word, a desperate plea for an escape that didn't exist. I apologize. I was stressed. The flight. I wasn't thinking." "You were thinking," Imani said, her voice cutting through her mother's sharp analysis with the simple, devastating truth. Imani had stood up now, too, completing the tableau of the family she had offended. "You thought I was someone you could bully. You thought my presence was an error. You thought these flight attendants would be afraid of you. You thought you were the most important person in this cabin. You were thinking all of those things. The only thing you got wrong was the last one." Annabelle stared at the 17-year-old girl she had tried to have ejected from the cabin. She was no longer just a girl in a tracksuit. She was a judge, delivering a verdict with a poise that Annabelle, in all her years, had never managed to acquire. The shame was a physical force, a crushing weight on her chest. Tears, genuine and hot, began to stream down Annabelle's face, carving paths through her expensive foundation. "Please," she sobbed, the sound raw and ugly. "I'll do anything. I'll apologize. I'll pay for her ticket." The offer was so absurd, so profoundly out of touch with the reality of the situation, that Marcus actually let out a short, humorless laugh. "Pay for her ticket," he repeated, shaking his head in disbelief. "Ma'am, the investment fund my family manages didn't just buy AscendAir. It owns the leasing company that holds the note on this very Boeing 707, the engine manufacturer that built the Rolls-Royce engines, currently keeping us in the air, and a controlling interest in the satellite communications company that allowed me to call the captain. You cannot possibly comprehend the scale of the insult you have delivered tonight." The sheer scope of his statement was dizzying. He wasn't just the owner. He was the entire ecosystem. Annabelle Sterling had not just picked a fight with a lion. She had picked a fight with the entire Serengeti. Her unraveling was now complete. She slumped in her seat, a weeping, defeated mess. Her Cartier bracelets felt like shackles, her pantsuit a ridiculous costume. The identity she had so carefully crafted over a lifetime had been exposed as a hollow shell. Captain Evans stepped forward again. "Mr. Washington," he said quietly, "what are your instructions?" Marcus looked at the sobbing woman, and for a moment, a flicker of something that might have been pity crossed his face. But it passed. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about consequences. Her behavior constitutes a Level 2 threat under the FAA's guidelines for passenger interference. Marcus stated, his voice now all business. "Intimidation and verbal harassment of crew and passengers. Upon landing at Heathrow, she is to be escorted off this aircraft by the proper authorities, not just airport security, the Metropolitan Police." He then looked at Sarah. "Sarah, I want you to file a formal report. Detail everything. Ms. Sterling's threats against your job. Ben's job, all of it. I want it on record." He paused, then delivered the final blow. "Furthermore, as of this moment, Annabelle Sterling is permanently banned from flying on AscendAir or any of our partner airlines for life. Her Platinum Elite status is revoked. Her accumulated miles are forfeited. She will be refunded the cost of this one-way ticket, and that will be the last transaction she ever has with this company." He looked at Annabelle. "You wanted your name to mean something to AscendAir Ms. Sterling. Congratulations. It now designates a zero-tolerance policy for bigotry." The verdict was absolute. There was no appeal, no negotiation. Annabelle Sterling's world had not just crumbled. It had been systematically dismantled item by item right in front of her. The unraveling was over. Now only the fallout remained. The remaining 5 hours of Flight 762 passed in a state of suspended animation. The first-class cabin, once a stage for high drama, became a silent tomb. Annabelle Sterling did not move. She sat bolt upright, her tear-streaked face a frozen mask of shock. The cashmere wrap lay forgotten on the floor. She was a statue of ruin, a modern-day Ozymandias whose kingdom of privilege had been shattered. The flight attendants served the meal service with quiet efficiency, but the atmosphere was irrevocably altered. They moved with a new sense of purpose, a renewed pride. Sarah, in particular, walked taller. The fear of corporate reprisal had been replaced by the certainty that she worked for a company that at its very highest level had her back. She treated the Washington family with a warm, genuine respect that went beyond professional courtesy. It was gratitude. Imani tried to read, but the words swam before her eyes. The adrenaline had subsided, leaving a hollow ache. She felt no joy in Annabelle's spectacular demise. It was just sad. It was sad that in this day and age such ugliness still existed, and sad that it took a demonstration of overwhelming power to address it. She looked at her father, who was now quietly speaking with Sarah, taking notes on her experiences, asking about crew morale training protocols and how such incidents were typically handled. He wasn't reveling. He was working. This ugly episode had become his first official act as owner, a field study in his new company's deepest flaws. As the plane began its long, graceful descent into London, the fasten seatbelt sign chimed a sound that seemed to jolt Annabelle from her catatonic state. A flicker of frantic, desperate energy returned to her eyes. She looked at the Washingtons, her expression pleading. She was like a drowning person searching for a life raft. "Please," she mouthed silently the word, a ghost in the air. Lena Washington met her gaze not with anger, but with a final dismissive sadness, and then turned her head to look out of the window at the sprawling lights of London. The time for pleas was long past. The gears of consequence were already turning. The landing was smooth, a gentle kiss of rubber on tarmac. As the Boeing 777 taxied towards the terminal, the usual bustle of passengers gathering their belongings was absent in first class. Everyone remained seated, watching, waiting. Through the window, Imani could see it, 2 police cars and a black airport authority vehicle, their lights flashing silently, waiting near the jet bridge. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to London Heathrow," Captain Evans's voice announced over the intercom. "For those passengers in first class, we ask that you please remain in your seats until our ground staff gives the all clear. Thank you." The jet bridge connected with a dull thud. The cabin door hissed open. 2 uniformed officers from the Metropolitan Police stepped onto the aircraft, their expressions serious and impassive. They were followed by a stern-faced AscendAir ground manager holding a tablet. The manager conferred briefly with Captain Evans, who gestured towards seat 2B. The officers walked down the aisle and stopped beside Annabelle. "Miss Annabelle Sterling?" the first officer asked, his British accent calm but firm. Annabelle could only nod, a wave of fresh tears beginning to fall. "Ma'am, we've received a report regarding a disturbance during this flight. I'm going to have to ask you to collect your belongings and come with us." The humiliation was absolute and public. As she fumbled with her carry-on, her hands shaking so violently she could barely work the latch. Every other passenger in the cabin watched in silence. The hedge fund manager recorded the entire scene on his phone, a smirk playing on his lips. This video, he knew, would be gold. As the officers escorted a sobbing, stumbling Annabelle Sterling off the plane, she passed the Washingtons one last time. Her eyes, red-rimmed and pleading, met Marcus's. He simply held her gaze, his expression unchanging until she was out of sight. Once she was gone, the AscendAir manager addressed the remaining passengers. "My apologies for the delay, ladies and gentlemen. You are now free to deplane. Mr. Washington, a private tour is waiting for you on the tarmac." As the Washingtons gathered their things, Sarah, the flight attendant, approached them. "Mr. Washington, Dr. Washington," she said, her voice thick with emotion. I just wanted to say thank you. In 20 years of flying, I've never seen a situation like that, handled with such integrity. You didn't just stand up for your daughter. You stood up for all of us." Marcus smiled warmly. "You were the one who showed integrity first, Sarah. You did the right thing when you thought it might cost you your job. That's the definition of character. AscendAir is lucky to have you." He handed her a business card. "I'll be setting up a new advisory council on in-flight experience and corporate culture. It'll report directly to my office. I'd like you to be on it." Sarah stared at the card, speechless. In the span of a 6-hour flight, she had gone from fearing for her job to being offered a seat at the table with the owner of the company. The fallout for Annabelle was swift and brutal. She was detained at Heathrow for several hours, questioned, and ultimately released with a formal caution and a fine for interfering with a flight crew. But that was the least of her worries. By the time she had checked into her hotel, the video was already going viral. The hedge fund manager had sent it to a popular travel blogger who had posted it with a sensational but accurate headline, "Racist Karen gets karmic justice after harassing new airline owner's daughter." Her name, Annabelle Sterling, was in the tweet. Her company, Sterling and Finch, was tagged. The internet did the rest. Within hours, she was the #1 trending topic on Twitter. Her face was everywhere. She was no longer a powerful consultant. She was a meme, a symbol of entitled bigotry. The partners at Sterling and Finch woke up to a firestorm. Their firm, which prided itself on its progressive image and lucrative D&I consulting wing, was being savaged online. Their inbox was flooded with angry emails. Clients were calling, demanding to know if they endorsed the behavior of their founding partner. By lunchtime in London, Annabelle received a terse encrypted email from her partners back in New York. There was no discussion, no negotiation. It informed her that effective immediately, she was being placed on indefinite leave. Her access to company systems was revoked. A board meeting had been scheduled for the following day to discuss the invocation of the morals clause in her partnership agreement, a clause that would allow them to expel her and seize her equity. She sat in the sterile luxury of her hotel room, the city of London buzzing outside her window, and realized she had nothing left. The career she had built, the reputation. She had polished the status she had worshipped. All of it had been incinerated in a single catastrophic lapse of judgment over the Atlantic. The fallout hadn't just begun. It was already over. She had lost everything. A week later, the name Annabelle Sterling was no longer a trending topic, but a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms and first-class lounges. Her expulsion from Sterling and Finch was finalized in a brutal, efficient meeting where her former partners, men and women she had mentored and vacationed with, read from a prepared statement and refused to meet her eyes. She was an outcast, a liability they'd jettisoned to save the sinking ship of their firm's reputation. She returned to New York, not on a premium airline, but on a budget carrier, seated in a cramped middle seat in the last row by the lavatories. The irony was so thick it was suffocating. No one recognized her, or if they did, they pretended not to. She had become invisible, her former power and presence erased. Her social circle evaporated. Invitations were rescinded. Friends stopped returning her calls. In the world she inhabited, a public scandal wasn't a mistake. It was a social disease, and no one wanted to risk infection. But the most profound consequences of Flight 762 were not the ones that befell Annabelle Sterling. They were the ones set in motion by Marcus Washington. The incident had been a wake-up call. It had shown him that owning a company was not just about balance sheets and profit margins. It was about shaping its very soul. His first official act as the new chairman of AscendAir was not to meet with the CFO, but to convene the new Advisory Council on In-Flight Experience and Corporate Culture. Sarah, the flight attendant, sat at the head of the table alongside pilots, gate agents, mechanics, and customer service representatives he had hand-picked. Imani sat in on that first meeting, not as a victim, but as a founding witness. What happened on Flight 762 was not an isolated incident, Marcus told the assembled group. It was a symptom of a culture where status is sometimes confused with a license to dehumanize, where procedures might exist on paper, but employees fear using them against a high-value customer. That ends today. Over the next few months, a series of radical changes which came to be known internally as the 762 Initiative were rolled out across AscendAir. First training was completely overhauled. The standard box-checking diversity slideshows were replaced with immersive scenario-based training, developed in partnership with Dr. Imani Washington's department at Columbia. Flight crews were drilled on de-escalation techniques that protected the victim, not placated the aggressor. They were explicitly empowered and required to report any incident of discriminatory behavior with a new system that bypassed middle management and went straight to a dedicated corporate ethics team. A new zero-tolerance policy was communicated to all passengers at booking and before every flight. Second, the frequent flyer program was re-evaluated. While perks and privileges remained, a new passenger code of conduct was introduced. Any passenger, regardless of status, found to be in violation of the code through harassment or discrimination would face immediate and permanent revocation of all privileges and a lifetime ban. The message was clear. Respect was not a commodity that could be purchased. Third, Marcus invested heavily in his employees. He increased pay across the board, improved benefits, and created new pathways for advancement. His philosophy was simple. A respected crew is an empowered crew. An empowered crew will protect the company's values and its passengers, all of them. Sarah was promoted to a newly created position, Vice President of In-Flight Culture, tasked with overseeing the implementation of the 762 Initiative. The ripple effect was enormous. Other airlines, initially skeptical, watched as AscendAir's customer satisfaction scores soared. Employee morale once flagging hit an all-time high. Talented pilots and flight attendants from rival carriers began applying in droves, wanting to work for a company that so publicly stood for something. Passengers, particularly those from marginalized communities, began choosing AscendAir, knowing it was an airline that had their back. The airline started winning awards, not just for its service, but for its corporate ethics. The story of Flight 762 became a legend within the company, a foundational myth. It proved that doing the right thing was not just good for the soul, but good for business. For Imani, the experience was transformative. The summer at the Royal Academy was a success, but she returned with a new sense of purpose. While her love for the arts remained, she also developed a keen interest in her father's work, not just the technology, but the ethics of power. She started an initiative of her own, a youth advisory board that consulted with companies on how to better serve and connect with a new generation of diverse consumers. One evening, months later, Imani was having dinner with her father on the terrace of their penthouse, overlooking the glittering expanse of Central Park. "Do you ever think about her?" Imani asked quietly. "Annabelle Sterling." Marcus looked out at the city lights, contemplating the question. "I don't think about her," he said finally. "But I think about what she represents. I think about the fact that for every Annabelle Sterling who has a public downfall, there are 1,000 more whose prejudice operates quietly in hiring decisions, in loan applications, in everyday interactions. What happened on that plane? It gave us an opportunity. We couldn't fix the world, but we could fix our corner of it. We could make AscendAir a model for what a company should be." He looked at his daughter, his heart swelling with a pride that had nothing to do with stock prices or acquisitions. "She tried to make you smaller, Imani. Instead, she made us all bigger." In that moment, the true nature of karma became clear. It wasn't just about punishment for the wicked. It was about the positive, powerful ripples that could be created from a single righteous stand. The legacy of Flight 762 wasn't Annabelle Sterling's ruin. It was the story of an airline that learned to fly higher. The story of Flight 762 is a powerful reminder that our actions, no matter how small or private we think they are, can have unimaginable consequences. It's a testament to the fact that true power isn't about wealth or status, but about character and integrity. Annabelle Sterling's world was shattered by her own prejudice, but the Washington family used that ugly moment to build something better, proving that the ultimate karma isn't just about seeing the bad get their due, but about seeing good rise from the ashes. If this story moved you, please hit that like button to help it reach more people. What did you think of the Washington family's response? Let us know in the comments below. And for more incredible true-life dramas and stories of justice, make sure you click subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss an update. Thank you for listening.